predetermined character represent me, or maybe should we take into consideration perspective, first versus third person? So I'll go ahead and read a bit and then discuss. So in the past decade, discussion regarding representation of identities in video games and the way in which they are mediated have taken a prominent role in discourse surrounding games and gamer culture. Much of the conversation revolves around either the construction of the player-avatar relationship or the analysis of virtual actors. If you could move one slide. From the perspective of race or gender identity frameworks as proposed by Leonard, Chen, de Castel, and others. Likewise, studies regarding player identification tend to fixate on degrees of identification with the on-screen avatar, as stated by Shaw, Carter, Gibbs, etc. These studies, while useful in understanding the types of avatars, and by the way here, I sometimes use avatar and character interchangeably, players identify with often fail to consider the aesthetic and ludic elements outside of race and gender. Furthermore, studies often fail to take into account the question of the type of avatar that the player identifies as instead of with. Indeed, although these studies are certainly valuable in helping us to understand players' reactions to on-screen actors, something that might be useful, as I suggest, in understanding how groups might react to certain on-screen representations of groups or individuals, they ignore the possibility of a player identifying with the on-screen avatar on a, and I'm sorry to throw this term out there, ludonarrative or even ludovisual considerations. So there you go. This aspect of the question of player ownership over avatar has been, I think, largely ignored. This issue is especially interesting when one considers the design practice of allowing the player to engage in avatar creation versus giving the player a predetermined character. As Pierce and Artemisa suggest, next, quote, the relationship between player and avatar is a complex subject that we are only beginning to understand. The present study attempts to shed light on this player-avatar relationship, focusing on the question of whether race and gender are indeed the major factors at play when a player relates to the character on screen, or whether ludic, visual, and narrative factors should also be taken into account. These factors being mainly that of perspective for the specific study. First, I'm going to talk about the theoretical foundations for understanding how relationships between players and the on-screen avatar are formed by discussing the framework proposed by Janet Murray and later elaborated on by James Paul Gee. I will then talk a little bit about the visual grammar, the model of visual grammar suggested by Crescent von Leeuwen, and then I will share some data that I've found. I basically had 67 individuals play a selection of games, and I asked them certain questions. Question number one, basically tell me about the game. And question number two, tell me about your experience with the game. And their answers were drastically different. So I'll start with a bit of the theory of the player-character relationship. Pretty much everyone acknowledges that the player, you, is an entity, some kind of a being. And the character is a separate entity. So here we have one more. The player on one side, the character on the other. And then the question of identifying with the character is what happens here in the middle of the Venn diagram. What's happening there? Go ahead and give me one more. According to Janet Murray, 1997, this was an idea that was accepted for a long time. In that intersection, what we have is a third being that is composed of you, the player, and the particular elements of the character. So, following up on the question that Andrew Latham, it was kind of mixed together, asked about Mario and how we might project ourselves onto Mario, and Link, of course. Murray would suggest that entity, Andrew as Link, Johan as Mario, is what exists. However, James Paul Gee, give me one more, would contend that what's happening there it's not the creation of a third identity, but rather what we should question is the process. What is happening in the player's mind? How does a player perceive what's being represented on screen? And a quote that I really like from his book, What Games Have to Teach About Learning and Literacy, is when Guy writes, I represent this identity as James Paul Guy, as beat beat. You might not see it here, but the emphasis is on the word as, focusing on the process. Where the word as is italicized to indicate that in this identity, the stress is on the interface between the interactions from the real world person and the virtual character. In my projective identity, I worry about what sort of person I want the character to be, what type of history I want her to have, and by the time I'm done playing the game. So essentially, it's a question not of how am I going to negotiate certain outcomes that I want with what the character wants, but rather a question of what would the character do? You know, like the character's a good guy, so we play as the good guy even when there are no people around. So how am I going to get the character to behave as the good guy? What are the choices that I'm going to make as a player, essentially to help the character along? Right? So if you could move on forward. Since then, though, discussions about player relations with characters have taken a different direction. They've evolved to a certain extent to focus on race and gender. One really interesting article called High-Tech Blackface, written by David J. Leonard, argues that this article focuses on sports schemes specifically. It looks at the player's relationship with avatar sports games, avatars. And the author argues that the genre of sports games represents a site of pleasure in which game players secure happiness through virtually occupying black bodies. And that because of social dynamics of race relations, questions of surveillance and dominance come into play. Essentially, when you have a player take control over a black avatar, well, what does that say about the relationship between races? The question of surveillance being, of course, the camera and the perspective that the player has. I'll give one more. Another article, a recent study, this one focusing on gender. A researcher showed that even though current representations of female genders in video games has improved, there is still surprisingly a long way to go, a really long way to go. And in his investigation, the author suggests that if we have depictions of genders that are more realistic, that are less sexualized, less objectified, that players will be more likely to see themselves as the video game characters. But the question that I raise is, well, what about the visual perspective? So go ahead and give me one more. And so there I bring in the framework of visual grammar presented by President Volneyman back in 2011. They argue that visual representations are socially and culturally situated in the process of making signs to express meaning. Essentially, they argue that the relationship between player and avatar relies heavily on the signified concept. And so building on that is where I drew my analysis from, my analysis of the interviews carried out to the players, where essentially I would ask a player, tell me about your experiences in the game, and if they would tell me that I did this, they would see themselves as the character. Whereas if they talked about the character from a third-person perspective, they're slaying, walking around, the Hyrule Flash, slaying zombies or whatever, then that would denote a lesser level of identification. So go ahead and give me the next one. So this study assumed certain given values for the terms I, you, etc. Assumed that identification can be verbalized. You can see the answers from 67 participants regarding the game and their experiences in the game. Originally, I surveyed 84 people. We surveyed, I started the study with 2 other individuals. But most of a small number didn't show up for the last two games, and so I consider those data outliers and didn't take those into account. So we just went forward with the 67 that actually did complete the sequence of games. So if you could give me one more. What I did was I had each of the players come in and play for 30 minutes, once a week. First, Mirror's Edge, first-person game with a female protagonist. I had them play Deus Ex Human Revolution, first-person game, male protagonist, and I had them play Skyrim, first-person game, you create your avatar. Then they came back, they played Catherine, third-person game, male avatar, male character, Tomb Raider, third-person, female character, and Mass Effect, third-person, player creates the character. And the answers that I got when I told them, tell me about your experiences with the game, were drastically different from the first-person games and those from the third-person games. Broadly speaking, if you could give me the next slide, the answers that I got for the first-person games were all from the first-person voice. So I would ask them, tell me about your experience in Mirror's Edge. Well, I was this chick who was walking around the roofs, and so I ran across the rooftops and I parkoured over and I kicked a cop in the face, etc., etc. Tell me about your experiences with Deus Ex Human Revolution. So I'm supposed to be this guy, and I wake up and I start shooting people inside a building, and I have no idea what's happening, etc., etc. And with Skyrim, there was an even higher percentage of people who used this kind of language, the I language. And you'll see something similar. You'll see a similar bump when we get to the third-person game. So have we the next one? With Mass Effect, what I found was a lot of third-person. I found a lot of, well, in this game, you controlled Shepard, and what I did is that I took Shepard through the Citadel, and I took Shepard through the planets. So here's Lara Croft, and she was being attacked by all these bad guys. In Catherine, it was specifically marked, perhaps because of the more distance perspective. There's this guy called Vincent, and he's trying to figure out if he should cheat on his girlfriend Catherine with another Catherine, etc., etc. They would essentially retell the story of the game, but not include themselves in the game. Now, this data, as it is, aggregates all the players that I have, but I do have a breakdown. So, Amber, if you let me sit there for a sec, I have the breakdown by race and gender, which is actually what I found the most interesting about the data. Let's see, here we go. What I found is that when it comes to white dudes, 100% of them use the I when talking about Mirror's Edge, Deus Ex, and Skyrim. Essentially, white dudes found no trouble projecting themselves into any type of character as long as that first-person perspective was there. When it comes to Mass Effect, Tomb Raider, and Catherine, we saw some of the participants show a little bit of distance. When it comes to white females, we saw that 100% identified with Faith, the female first-person character. But when it came to Deus Ex Human Revolution, some of them drew back and they instead told me the story of Adam Jensen. It's no longer I, it's now that guy over there whom I am inhabiting. And then in Skyrim, 100% of them said that, yes, I am the character in the game. With Mass Effect and Tomb Raider and Catherine, all of them identified as the character, all of them used I, which I actually found really interesting because in Mass Effect, they actually had the option of creating their avatar, their version of Shepard, and some of them shied away from taking on the role of Shepard, whereas all of them talked about Vincent in a first-person perspective. With Hispanics, both males and females, I found something really interesting. There was a lot of second-person voice. So here's what you do. Whether we're talking about Skyrim, where you take control of the Dragonborn and you go around killing dragons, or whether we're talking about the third-person perspective, Catherine, or Tomb Raider, where you take control of Laura and here's what you do. with Laura. And this is a bit of a hypothesis at this moment, but being Hispanic myself, I think that it probably has to do, I should note that a lot of my Hispanic subjects were ESL, probably has to do with the way that the Spanish language is structured, and how we talk about video games in Spanish, where we say almost universally, if I may use Spanish, cuando tú juegas un juego, esto es lo que tú haces. So, when you play a game, here's what you do. And so I could see that kind of literal translation of the U taking place with the Hispanic subjects. And then for my African Americans subjects, I saw a really big disconnect. About half of them roughly would use the first person, roughly half would use second or third person. What I did notice with my African American students is that the divide was almost universally along the lines of which schools they came from. They came from good schools, from upper class schools. They would use the standard first person games, and then the third person language to describe third person perspective. And if they came from urban schools with little resources, they would almost universally use the U. So I found that interesting, and it's data that I'm going to continue analyzing as I move forward and hopefully turn this into a manuscript. I also have data on a large number of Indian students who I was unable to really get into the data yet. I have a couple of students from Iraq and about 10 students from South Korea whose data I still haven't parsed through. But it's in the works, and hopefully I'll know that within the next 6 months and have a full manuscript. So as far as some concluding remarks, I'll go back to the presentation and say that perhaps unsurprisingly, the data collected shows that when a first-person perspective is used by the game designer, most players see themselves as being in the game regardless of whether the character is designed by the player or predetermined by the game, meaning that the first-person perspective leads to both player immersion and player identification with the character. The data also shows that most players don't become fully immersed in the character's self if a third-person perspective is used. However, it also shows that players develop a sense of ownership over the game avatar if the player was able to participate in its creation. So I own the Dragonborn, who I also am, but I also own Shepherd, whom I'm not. Furthermore, it shows that players identify to varying degrees with third-person avatars they create, but that player identification as pre-designed third-person character is minimal, at least when compared with the first person, when we are placed in the first person perspective of character. And that is it for me. Any questions?